Chapter 2. A rather worried-looking policeman did come to the house later that same evening to question Muddy about the elephant we were keeping in our garden. But Muddy was expecting just such a visit from the authorities and had thought of everything. She read him out a letter from the hair director of the zoo, giving his permission and declaring that the elephant was a young one, only 4 years old, recently orphaned, and so needed special care and attention, that she was an unusually calm elephant and quite safe to be left under the supervision of Muddy overnight, that he had inspected the garden himself, and there was no danger whatsoever to the public. The policeman wanted to read the letter himself, and even then he still wanted to check that the garden where Marlene was being kept was secure. So we took him out there to show him, Carly leading the way. Marlene was sheltering in her shed. The policeman didn't want to get too close. I could see that. He walked across the garden and rattled the gate to satisfy himself that it was safely shut. But he said we should chain it up just to be sure. When he turned around, he found Marlene was right there in front of him. She had come to introduce herself. She did this by reaching out her trunk to touch his face. He looked very alarmed at this, but when a few moments later, Marlene's trunk happened to knock off his cap, and we all laughed. He had to laugh too. After that, he went away happy, leaving us happy too, and relieved that Marlene was now officially allowed to stay. And Carly, in particular, could not stop giggling about the policeman's hat being knocked off. Later, it became one of those family stories we all went on telling, but Carly told it best, mimicking the shock of the policeman's face wonderfully well. After that first day, with Muddy bringing Marlene home every evening, everyone wanted to come and have a look at the orphan elephant in the garden. And all of our friends suddenly wanted to come see us. Some of them were friends that until now we never knew we even had. Inquisitive faces were forever peering through the bars of the garden gate. Marlene loved all this adoration, and Carly did too. He was always out there in the garden with her, making quite sure everyone knew that Marlene was his own personal elephant. Marlene loved it when people offered her tidbits. She'd take anything, stale bread crust, cabbage leaves, and even an apple or bun sometimes. But I think she was always hoping for potatoes. As Muddy said, they were her real passion. So whenever anyone appeared at the gate, Marlene would always wander over with Carly and accept their offerings only too willingly. There was a problem with all this, quite a big problem actually, apart from the fact that we seemed to be an open house now to the whole neighborhood, and that was very soon huge piles of elephant dung began to appear in the snow all over the garden, like giant molehills they were. Wonderful for the vegetable garden, Muddy said. We carted it away in barrow loads to a pile in the corner of the garden. Carly seemed to love doing this. Anything to do with Marlene he loved, but I hated it. You cannot imagine how much there was of it, nor how smelly it was. It was hard, I discovered, to push a wheelbarrow and hold your nose at the same time. It was a few days before I plucked up enough courage to go into the garden to see Marlene on my own. She came out to meet me from her woodshed, wandering slowly towards me, snuffling at the snow with her trunk as she came. She rumbled at me contently from somewhere deep and echoing inside of her, and then explored my hair and face with the tip of her trunk, her way of saying hello. When I reached up to stroke her ear, I think she hoped I had brought her a potato. I would have done so, too, if I had thought of it. But she did not seem too disappointed. We let our eyes do most of the talking, I remember. We stood there with the snow coming down around us, each of us knowing, I was sure of it, that we were making a friend for life. I did sense in her eyes the depth of the grief that she was still suffering after the loss of her mother. And without my ever saying anything, I knew she understood all my own fears about Poppy, about the bombers that might come any day now, and about the war. Marlene was always so accepting and so patient. I never once saw her irritated or angry until the day the dog came, that is. It was a big dog, a loud dog, a German shepherd, I think, but I can't be sure. This dog would appear suddenly at the garden gate and bark at her, his whole body shaking with fury. He kept coming back again, and every time Marlene would run at him across the garden, trumpeting, tossing her ears, flapping them, but that only infuriated the dog even more. We all tried to drive him off, rattling a stick at him through the bars of the gate and shouting at him to go away. Carly hurled some dung at him once, but none of it was any use. Sooner or later, that wretched dog always came back. Then one evening, the dog's owner was there with him at the gate, the dog barking his head off as usual. We could hear that Marlene was becoming frantic again, and Carly was out there shouting at him to clear off. So Muddy went running out to the garden, and I followed her. She told the man that enough was enough, that his dog was out of control and frightening the elephant. They had a heated row through the bars of the gate, and the man went away swearing and shaking his fist, shouting at us that the park was a public place, that his dog had every right to bark, and that elephants belonged in zoos anyways. Muddy went off fuming with indignation about him all evening. All during supper and afterwards, she kept getting up to look out the window to check on Marlene. I could see she was becoming very anxious about her. In the end, she went out to see her in the garden. "She is still pacing up and down out there," Muddy said as she came back inside. "She does that in her cage at the zoo whenever she's feeling unhappy about something. That horrible dog has really upset her. I shall take her for a walk. That usually settles her down. I think that is what she needs. There is a lovely full moon out there. Will you come with us, children?" The truth is, I didn't want to. I was warm where I was and certainly did not want to go out there into the cold again. But of course, Carly hardly needed an invitation. He already had his boots on and was shrugging himself into his coat. "Can I hold her trunk, Muddy?" he cried. "She likes me to hold her trunk." They were halfway out the door already by now. I only went with them because I did not want to be left behind. I grumbled about it, I remember. "Do we really have to?" I moaned. But no one was listening to me. I made sure I was going to be as warm as I could be. I pulled my hat down over my ears, wrapped my scarf around me, and then grabbed Carly as he was going out the door and did the same for him. Put on his hat and scarf because he hadn't bothered. He hated me fussing over him. He just wanted to get out there and be with Marlene. Moments later, we were through the gate and out into the park beyond, the snow bright with the moonshine, and the whole world silent and peaceful about us. Carly was leading Marlene by her trunk, making his usual clicking noises, and telling her to gee up, just like he had always done with the Tommy back on Uncle Manfred's farm. I noticed again something I had often noticed before, that when Carly was at his happiest, he limped much less. He was stomping on ahead of us through the snow with Marlene, and there was scarcely a sign of a limp at all. Muddy put her arm through mine as we walked. "Wherever Papi is, at the same moon for him, Elizabeth," she said. "Maybe he is looking up at it right now, like we are." That was the moment the dog came bounding out at us from under the trees, barking wildly. I saw at once it was the same German Shepherd that had been tormenting Marlene through the gate. Muddy was running at him, clapping her hands and shouting at him, but the dog would not be put off, would not go away. Instead, he circled round Marlene, snarling and growling at her. That was what made Marlene suddenly whirl around to face him, sending Carly sprawling into the snow. I ran to him at once and helped him to his feet. By the time I looked up again, Marlene was charging off through the snow, chasing the dog away, trumpeting as she went, her trunk flailing, her ears in full sail. And Muddy was stumbling after her, calling for her to stop. But I could see that there would be no stopping Marlene now until she had either chased the dog out of sight or had trampled him to death.